I think a good place to start would be just say thank you for coming on, and also could you just give us a brief description of your background in history and your kind of broad knowledge of World War II?
Nico, thank you very much. It's a pleasure talking to you. I have worked for the University of London in a number of different guises for the past 23 years, and prior to that, the Australian National University in Canberra and Victoria University in New Zealand. So I've been teaching 20th century history, 19th and 20th century history, the world economy, the Cold War, a whole range of issues. But the Second World War has been pivotal in explaining what has happened in the 20th century. The First World War set up the agenda. The Second World War really drove us into the situation that we find today. And the legacy of the Second World War, to a certain degree, is still with us. So I've been teaching courses which start in 1945, or the consequences of 1945 have been dictating on how we are dealing with the world today.
When I try and speak to friends my age about the war, it seems to be a very short conversation. It's really just not spoken about. And I think the next generation are talking about it even less. And I wonder, what do you think are the lasting effects of the war? What are the things we're not talking about? And what things is it good that we're not talking about it, or should we be talking about it?
Okay. First, in terms of the lasting effects, from a British perspective, there's an element where we are still obsessed by the Second World War, because ultimately 1940 and 1941 was the zenith of Britain's influence and importance in the world. There's a very good book that came out of Princeton University Press a couple of years ago called How Britain Saved the West. And it's that fortitude against Nazism that really gave the platform for the Allies to drive back fascism in the 4 years following 1941. A lot has changed, obviously, as a result of 1945. But what we see from 1941 with the Atlantic Charter, so if you like, a formation of a trade-based special relationship, and the idea of self-determination, end of empire, free trade, that set an agenda from 1945 to 1973, and ultimately still with us now. So you think about the World Trade Organization. That was conceived of in 1944.
Do you think what we learn in schools now in the UK and across Europe, do you think we're taught enough about the war, and do you think we're being taught the right message? Are we getting the right message?
I don't think we're being taught enough about the excesses of the war. And I'll give you an example. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, huge international hit as a novel, and a well-made BBC production for the cinema. Does not accurately portray the experience of children when it came to the concentration camps, because ultimately they were liquidated early on. Now, that is used as a gateway to help children into understanding what's going on. And the author never claimed that it was accurate. He described it as a fable. But when you have the Diary of Anne Frank emphasizing very much what it was to be Jewish and persecuted, and ultimately to be dobbed in, so to speak, that one of her neighbors alerted the Nazis occupying in the Netherlands, you have a richer experience from reading the real accounts than you do from a fictionalized version. So
would you say, just to jump in there, would you say that the fictionalized versions of war, and you could even say Saving Private Ryan, Spielberg's film, I mean, these are all kind of like, they're sort of a manifest of ideas and also a bit of patriotism and all this stuff, and they become something probably that the actual war wasn't about originally, but gives us all this sort of false sense of World War II, because I think it's very hard. I don't think people of my generation really understand, unless they've studied it in detail, what it was, what happened. And you can see how separated we are now by COVID-19, but maybe this is kind of how the world was back then. It was split apart, and people were like, how did this happen? And
Well,
yeah.
in Britain, we had restrictions when it came to the Blitz. We've now got a halfway house in terms of lockdown light, just clicking in.
Mm-hmm.
I would point you to something that I think is very illuminating on a number of counts. Andrea Levy's Small Island. Now, that's an excellent novel, and it is dealing with African Caribbean members of the Royal Air Force and how they're treated in Britain. But the side issue that comes with that is during the Second World War, America still had segregated armed services. So the Red Tails, those African American pilots, could not serve as pilots in the same squadrons as European Americans. So you get a view through fiction that can help you understand what's happening. And the point being that with Small Island, it's portraying the American GIs as being extremely prejudiced against members of the British Empire, whatever their ethnicity, their creed, their race, being accepted in the English or the British communities, while at the same time identifying those same people coming to Britain as part of the Windrush generation and being racially abused because the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Celtic contingent didn't want them there. So it's one thing, and Christopher Hitchens was always very strong on this. Britain stood alone, point I made earlier. Britain and its empire of 700 million people stood against Nazism. And it is the contribution that we see from the world over that allowed Britain to survive 40 and 41. And it is the contribution, Gallipoli in the First World War and how that helped form Australian and New Zealand identity. Very important in that regard. The fall of Singapore in 1942 and the ability of the Royal Navy to defend sea lanes to Australia and New Zealand, again, is another statement that the Australians in particular talk about, well, can we depend on Britain? The Bengal famine of 1943, very rarely talked about, unless you happen to be an Indian historian or a British Asian, and the fact that Churchill made the decision not to divert supplies to India, where at least 1 million people died, because the campaign in Europe was seen to be a priority.
As you travel through Europe, you see people have different ideas of things. And like you say, if you go to India, you've got a historian who will pinpoint what happened, the starvation in Bengal. And I think we're now, because of Black Lives Matter, the statues, even Churchill was suddenly questioned. And I actually thought, in a good way, it's bringing us back to something that does need to be looked at and say, well, Britain wasn't all good. Germany wasn't necessarily all bad. It doesn't work like that in the real world, does it? It's not black and white.
If you look at German history, there's a lot of discussion about the attempt to assassinate Hitler. It failed, but the reason being that at least that indicates the concept that there was an opposition and there was a willingness to stand up, however failed that was. You cannot tar the entire generation that grew up and suffered 1933 to 1945 in Germany as being complicit. You definitely can't say that to the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren who had nothing to do with those atrocities. It's forgetting that 11.5 million people died, or even worse, denying that 11.5 million people died in the camps.
So we always remember the 6 million Jews perished, but you're talking about an 11 million that we don't often talk about, because you're talking about the other people that were persecuted. Can you tell us
Yeah,
about that?
and I don't want in any way to diminish the Holocaust and the terrible plight that those who were Jewish in Germany and Eastern Europe suffered. But 2 million Soviet prisoners of war likely died there. And if you had gender preferences or religious beliefs or physical or mental impairments, many died in the camps as a form of extreme eugenics. And it is difficult to understand how such an educated, cultured society as Germany permitted that to happen, because Adolf Hitler was allowed to do that. The popular plebiscites, the referenda that allowed him to push forward dictatorial control with popular support were outlawed under West Germany because they distorted democracy to such a degree. And it's killing all of those who did not conform. Okay, and something that you mentioned to me, the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. That's the purge of the brown shirts. Once in power, how does Hitler maintain his control? He gets rid of anyone who could be possibly a challenge, in exactly the same way as Stalin did it with the Great Terror around about 1937.
It was, I mean, I was watching Sopranos around the same time, but I couldn't help but get a bit of a parallel there of just how mafia they will destroy their opposition, and how, Hitler in some way was able to do this. But that surely was to do with the Great Depression that came before and the anger of the people, do you think, that allowed this kind of culture to...
I think the Great Depression and the legacy of the Treaty of Versailles radicalized the German people to the degree that they wanted strength again. And remember, we don't talk about it so much, but the German Revolution after the First World War and the replacement of the Kaiser, the end of the royal family, suddenly the imperial past of Prussia was taken away. Their prominence was taken away. And the Treaty of Versailles was an indication of how fractious alliances were, because after 5 months, the Allies didn't want to talk to each other, and they definitely didn't want to talk to Germany about their terms. Now, ultimately, Germany could have conformed and could have made reparation payments. It would have been incredibly difficult. But the attitude of France on one hand, and Britain and America on the other, by never settling on terms that would be viable, said to the German people, these are not terms we should accept. And something that you raised with me, and I think it is important to bear in mind, 1931, Germany was given the 1936 Olympics to welcome them back into the international fold. Now, it is not so much the Great Depression, although yes, that definitely made a number of countries in Europe more open to a radical alternative. It is the decade where the Germans were told, you are to blame for the First World War up to 1938, and then 1928 rather, and then the economic downturn that followed, that permitted someone like Adolf Hitler to A, get a hold in the political forums, and B, to corrupt what's going on. And it was a corruption of that intelligence, that culture, that understanding that really is the great crime, because it then permitted internal purges and a war where about 27 million Soviets died
Yes.
as a result of the Second World War.
So the Olympics, I think they had both the Olympics in the same year or something ridiculous, like the summer and the winter Olympics in the same year. And it is weird to see, like, so it must have been common knowledge certainly to politicians at the time that Hitler was a bad person up to no good, but to then hand him the Olympics, what kind of message is that sending?
Remember that 1931, it was still the Weimar Republic. Hitler was not seen to be a credible politician. Remember that the businesses in Germany that supported Hitler thought he was a joke. They thought he was someone they could manipulate and control, and they thought he was weak.
Yes.
So no one in their right mind would have given that sort of propaganda victory to Hitler.
Yes.
But 2 years after the awarding, you could run with it and take it forward. So
I didn't
really that critical change, yeah?
I didn't think about that. Of course, you get awarded it well before, so you prepare for it. So he just happened to be there when they were, so the decision was made a lot earlier on. I see. Now that makes a lot of sense. It wasn't like it just suddenly happened overnight.
No, but you can go back, and I'd need to check exactly when this happened, but I believe the English football team, in playing Germany, were instructed to give the Sieg Heil salute because of the German regime.
Yes.
And I think that's a matter of national shame.
Yes.
Because it is one thing to accept how a country's leadership is different, shall we politely say, another way to show how they're endorsed. So think about the taking of a knee and how that has been an indication of an unwillingness to accept what is happening. Now that is the complete opposite of actually giving the Nazi salute, which we find in the 1930s. Taking of the knee now is a willingness to say we are not going to accept the past as it informs and distorts the future and the present. And I think that's a key point. And I still find it incredibly distasteful that there is any racism in football in this country, in Britain, but it still happens.
Yes.
And, it comes to the point, when are you going to stop distinguishing people by a stylized version of their skin pigmentation and start dealing with them as individuals? So I taught a course a couple of years ago called From Mussolini to Trump. And I'm very much against the idea of describing anyone as white.
Yeah.
Right. I'm a very sad pinko grey, which is an Ian Foster phrase, yeah?
Yes.
But white is the most negative 19th century concept that we still have with us. And one of my students said, well, Emmett, why don't you want to be white? I said, no, I am Anglo-Celtic. When I lived in New Zealand, that was the ethnicity description of their forms, and it perfectly identified me as someone with British and Irish heritage. We still need to break from the vestiges of the colonial period and, if you like, the imperial period up to the Second World War, as it informs the way we view people. And just calling them white is a problem.
It is.
I don't like using the term black. British Asian or African Caribbean, and not wishing to be patronizing, are better ways of describing British citizens who come from a diverse ethnic background.
Absolutely. I mean, we all come from somewhere, and we're made up of all kinds of things, and it's the geography that's the key there, really. Using the color and perpetuating this idea that there is a difference, it's the color that's the difference, is crazy, because clearly that isn't. And the more we talk about it, the more that it becomes part of common language.
Well, just think about Christopher Nolan's film Dunkirk, which was a real triumph.
Yeah, very good film, yes.
And there was a controversy that it didn't show sufficient of the Sikh troops or the imperial troops being evacuated. Now, it's a very personal film if you look at the way that it's structured. It deals with small groups of individuals. It's not a broad history or portrayal of everything, although you do see thousands of people. But one of the things I found interesting is there are colonial troops portrayed fairly early on in the film. They just happen to be French trying to get into the British queues. And you've got to remember that, you know, even up to the period of de Gaulle, you know, you look at Algeria, Algeria was considered as part of France, you know, not as a colony, but as an extension of the nation as a whole. So, you know, it's very difficult to say, are you going to be tokenistic? Are you going to be comprehensive in any entertainment?
Yeah.
But are you actually also going to be balanced and not portray a society that is not uniformly of one ethnicity? And I think that that's one thing that hopefully we can move away from, is the idea that to be English means that you have to look like us. We have always been a cosmopolitan nation. And again, it's emphasized within, you know, the Second World War, within the play, which the National Theatre, I think, put on perhaps a decade or so ago, English People Very Nice. And it dealt with the waves of immigration around Bethnal Green. So the Huguenots from France, okay, the Jewish migrants, the Irish, and then those coming from Bangladesh. And it is the waves of migration that comes in. Okay, one of the things that came out with Brexit and those people who were more insular in their view, that Anglo-Saxon means French, Danish, Northern German.
Right.
That term encompasses a migrant society.
Yeah,
it just happens to be millennia ago, but it's the same principle.
It's the same principle. And so what we would call that the Britain is made up of those people?
Yeah, and the Second World War is an
Yeah.
emphasis on how people came together against an idea they found abhorrent.
Yeah.
And the point I'd made to you, Richard, and you know, touch on the Atlantic Charter is about one side of A4. You know, it's easily accessible. You can download it. And Roosevelt said self-determination is critical. Countries need to be able to determine their own futures. Now, that is effectively saying, if we win the war, France, the Netherlands, Portugal, Britain, your empires are not viable. Now, whether Churchill really thought that was going to happen, I don't know. But it said, the Americans were saying, we're fighting a war against expansionist empires. Italy, the Atlantic Charter predates Pearl Harbor, so I'll stand corrected slightly there. The Atlantic Charter made the point that in cooperating with Britain, America was looking to break up imperialism in Europe and East Asia. The Japanese, the Italians, the Germans. And we date the Second World War from 1929. Japan and China were continually part of the Second World War from 1937, when Japan started the invasion, and we have the War of Resistance on mainland China. But the Eurocentric view and the Atlantic view is a legacy of 1945 and that alliance against the Soviet Union. So our view of history is filtered through. It is America coming to support Britain, and with our Soviet allies crushing the fascists, not the world increasingly engaged in warfare from 1937 to 1941, And the war of the century was the Eastern Front, because that was the bloodiest conflict ever seen.
The Eastern Front is?
That is the Nazis against the Soviets. They did for Napoleon, they did for Hitler.
Yes. I mean, you bring up Napoleon. So, I mean, I read a brief book about Napoleon, and it seems to be he's almost kind of, it's almost like Napoleon was this great conqueror, you know, and he would walk into countries and destroy, take over. And he seems to be remembered in an entirely different way to, say, Hitler is.
Napoleon conquered Europe with tens of thousands of troops. The Battle of Waterloo might have been fought with 30 to 50,000 troops. And I need to check back, but we're not talking about huge numbers. You could take over countries with armies and mercenary groups, and most people would not be directly affected. When you get to the Spanish Civil War, you start seeing Nazi Germany testing tactics that were going to be successful up until the Soviet Union invasion. Okay, so from 1937, so 1936 with the Spanish Civil War, but we know Guernica as being infamous because of the civilian casualties of aerial bombing and Pablo Picasso's arguably most famous painting.
Yes, absolutely. I remember you talking about that. And so this again was 1936. This is before the Poland invasion, the invasion of Poland.
Yeah, 1936 to 1939. Adolf Hitler worked on the basis of having a very large standing army, largely to buy off the generals, gave them lots of troops. Right. The second part of that, German engineering was excellent. So up until the Eastern Front, Germany won its victories through speedy movement of troops and overwhelming defenses. Battle of Britain was different. It had equal forces on both sides. It's not the way it's portrayed, but roughly the bombers and the fighters matched up. Okay, and Britain was able to successfully defend. It's the first major defensive battle in history that could be said to have changed the course of a war, because it bought the time. Even though the Blitz continued, it bought the time. But Germany, when it came to trench warfare and the equivalent, and here is the big difference from both sides, and why the Second World War shows that a reliance on technology was not always the best solution. After 1940, even though you had the Messerschmitt Bf 109s, it's only the Focke-Wulf FW 190 was the last new aircraft that the Germans designed that made any difference. The ME 262, the first operational jet fighter, was lauded for its technological advancement, but its engines, you know, coaxial engines would last about 10 to 11 hours. And in the end, you didn't have pilots or the appropriate oil to lubricate the aircraft to put it into the air. The Germans went for technological solutions when actually what they needed was practical production. So it's about resources.
Yeah.
And that was the key thing. Attacking the Soviet Union and gaining all of the fertile land and productive capacity, all right, west of the Urals was the objective. When Germany failed to do that and Britain took the oil fields in North Africa, there is an argument that Germany had, quotes, lost the war, unquotes. So you've got an idea of how oil still remains an important resource today. The most heavily fortified Nazi possessions were the Romanian oil fields.
Oh, right. Okay.
They couldn't conceive of losing the one set of fuel oil production that they actually had control of. So I regret to say the modern world, in terms of fixation of oil and the Middle East, hasn't really gone away.
No, definitely not.
Right?
So we're just going back to the Napoleon thing. Are you actually saying that, I mean, it's a totally, you can't compare them?
No, I mean,
it's different.
France, as we understand it, didn't exist. There was what we see as a modern country of France.
Right, yes.
You know, you just think about the quote from Garibaldi, all right? Now we have made Italy, the next stage is to make Italians. You actually have to impose an identity. The nation state is a very, very recent evolution of human society. It is only really where we have a contiguous nation in a defendable geographic area with a single unitary government. In most of the cases, the modern world only dates from 1945. Countries were conglomerates of smaller nations. Italy, for many, many centuries, was dominated by its trading states. What we think as the nation of Italy didn't literally exist.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, and that's the key thing. Alliances would change. Britain had reasonable stability, but there was always the challenge from trading. Perhaps, you know, in the 17th century, Britain wanted to be like the Netherlands. The Netherlands was the most successful trading nation in the world.
Yeah, had the first stock market, I believe.
Absolutely, and you know, it really is a case that you see links between Amsterdam and London being very, very important in pushing that forward. The Second World War had the imprint of the nation state.
Yes.
Okay, you define countries as being independent, they have their own government, and you break a link to the mother country or the metropole and the periphery, however you want to put it. So the legacy of the Second World War is saying this is the template that everyone has to work to. Mm-hmm. And you look at Iraq, which is a legacy of the British mandate, okay, from the First World War. And effectively, it's three nations welded together, okay? Or the fact that Macedonia can't call itself Macedonia. It's now, and you will forgive me, I think Northern Macedonia, and has been for a long time, the former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia, to stop offending the Greeks, because nations and states don't necessarily mean they're the same thing. The Kurds are not exclusively in Turkey or in northern Iraq. Okay. Likewise, the Macedonians are not exclusively in what is now northern Macedonia or in the northern areas of Greece. They have a cultural link which predates the development of modern boundaries.
I see. Sorry, I didn't. I think I now understand more about what you mean by nation state, because states live within a nation. So it's a way of allowing a country to be a country with people with different points of view, in a way.
Yeah, and there's two parts of this. The way that 19th century empires drew the boundaries could have nothing to do with the traditional areas that a people, a nation, might actually occupy.
Yeah.
And we're still living with some of the legacies with this.
Yeah.
Think about the Basques. Think about how France and Spain are dealing with these issues. Think about how Sicily has a separate identity from the rest of Italy.
Palestine?
Palestine is something that was created. Israel, I mean, I am very strong on the idea that Israel should have self-determination and a defendable state. But I also believe the Palestinians deserve that as well.
Yes.
And what has happened since 1948
Mm-hmm.
has been very difficult to reconcile within a Middle Eastern context, or even the settlement of self-determination. You know, and again, we go back to the legacy of the Second World War. Criticizing Israel is not criticizing every Jewish person, but some people equate them.
Yeah, of course, and that has its complications. Do you think overall, if you look at Europe, are we still dealing with kind of a massive hangover from the World War II? Do you think?
We have moved on beyond that, but the legacy is still with us. And if you want a view of that, look at Germany itself and look at the status of the East Germans within modern federal Germany.
I'm aware of it because people mention it. Yeah, there's a certain stigma attached. There's no wall there. The wall's gone, but there's still these invisible lines, but they're still there, and they are going from generation to generation. And I still think we need to look at the war and look at the kind of psychology that's running through the generations. Because I mean, the war itself is so complex. There's so many different stories to be told. At the same time, I think we need to make sure that the stories are being told properly and the right stories have been told, so lessons can be learned.
So we can definitely still tell new stories about the Second World War, Nico. But the idea that the Holocaust is an Eastern European tragedy is something that's come up reasonably recently.
We've been an hour. It's much longer than I expected. So I'll just, and thank you so much for your time. And there's so much more we could go into. And I think, but just great just to ramble and go off on tangents with you on World War II. Thanks so much.
Good to talk to you again. Real pleasure. And let's see what we can pick up on this one.
Thank you very much, Emmett. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.